Since I've started making cave story content, something I've been told a lot is that I've introduced people to cave story, and I love that I can introduce new people to the game. But one thing new fans might immediately run into is a choice between two different versions of cave story. Those versions are the Aeon Genesis translation and the official / Nicalis translation. If that didn't give today's topic away, then today, yes, we'll be talking about the differences between the two versions, as well as give a little history on them, where the fanbase stands, and what version you should play if it's your first time playing. But of course, I've had some help with this video, and I'd like to give a shout out to Super Something, who helped me gather and solidify the information in today's video. Please go check them out with their links in the description below, and tell them I said hello. And before we settle differences and which version you should play, I think it's important that we look into each translation and how they were made. The history behind both translations really interests me, so let's go ahead and get started with the first one, the Aeon Genesis translation. The Aeon Genesis translation is the earliest translation of the game, being released on January 31st, 2005. The translation was incredibly done in the span of 3 weeks by Gideon Z, Shitsu, Tomato, and Bugcatcher. Of the four, Shitsu was actually able to get in direct contact with Daisuke Amaya and get the team's blessing to make the translation for the game. Pixel was also able to give the team a dev build of the game, as well as help with a few pieces of ambiguous text. Shitsu actually goes way more in depth about learning about the game, getting in contact with Pixel, and how he feels on the aftermath on his blog, which I'll go ahead and link in the description below. Seriously, the story is super interesting to read, and I'd really hate to just copy and paste his words, so go ahead and check out the blog below. And if the team is watching, thanks for making the translation. Plenty of fans, including myself, highly appreciate your work, so thank you. Now with the Aeon Genesis bit out of the way, let's dig into the Nicalis / official translation of the game. According to one of Nintendo's developer's voice interviews, Tyrone was discussing freeware indie games with a friend when his friend brought up and showed him Cave Story. He then followed this up by emailing both Nintendo and Daisuke Amaya to try and get the game on WiiWare. Eventually, both Nintendo and Daisuke would approve of the project, and Daisuke Amaya would be brought onto the team to help with things including translating the game for an English audience. Something interesting to note is that before the game's official Wii release, the game's official website was purported by fans to use the Aeon Genesis translation in the game's featured screenshots. As well, Nicalis apparently directly thanked the Aeon Genesis team for their translation of the game. However, in my search, I have found no proof of this, and trust me, I really looked, but there are plenty of message boards out there saying that this was something that happened. Either way, take this info with a grain of salt. And now with some fun history on the two translations out of the way, let's dig into the nitty-gritty on differences and why there's such a divide in the community. In defense of the Aeon Genesis translation, many people still stick by it simply because it was the first translation of the game. It was quite a handful of people's first experience with the game. Not to mention, the Aeon Genesis translation is the one primarily used for the freeware version of the game. So not only was it first, but it's also the free version of the game. And what is possibly the biggest defense for the Aeon Genesis translation is the charm and character of it all. The Aeon Genesis translation really does kind of define early indie games of the era and the effort people had to put into playing these games. Only a select handful of people would translate Japanese games in their spare time, and they would get shared almost exclusively on forums and blog posts, with the files directly being shared from player to player. And not to mention, the actual translation itself has tons of neat quirks of the early internet, and the game overall has a more laid-back, casual tone with the dialogue and text that just makes the game a lot more fun for players. Since its release though, the team has come out talking about the errors that were later found in the translation, but people still stick by it since the errors were fairly minor, with the biggest faults being less accurate wording and tone in some of the lines said. Probably the biggest example of this is Balrog's iconic huzzah, but we'll go ahead and get into that later. Either way, the Aeon Genesis translation was a passion project and is still viewed as the best way to play Cave Story by many fans to this day. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and look at the other side of that same coin with the Nicalis translation. While the Aeon Genesis team was given blessing and a bit of help by Pixel, The Nicalis translation was overall handled a lot more professionally when compared to the Aeon Genesis translation. Nicalis even had Pixel involved a lot more. This gives the Nicalis versions of the game the most accurate translation of the game, with even the Switch version given some slight text tweaks purely to make the game as accurate as possible. Another bonus to the Nicalis translation of the game is just how accessible it is. As the official version of the game, it has been available to Nintendo fans on a variety of platforms since the Wii, with the Wii U being an exception. While fans have and continue to port freeware to a ton of platforms, you can't access it without a bit of work into getting homebrew running on your platform of choice, or by simply using emulators on your PC. But if you're choosing to run a port on PC via emulator, just play freeware. If you really want to play on a platform like 3DS or Switch, the Nicalis translation of the game is far more easier to get your hands on. And finally, while this isn't exactly at the fault of the translation, most Nicalis versions of the games are easily the definitive versions of Cave Story, with plenty of quality of life improvements that make Cave Story a lot easier to play through over and over again. And many fans would also agree that the Nicalis translation is the ideal way to play the game. Alright, now with both translations covered, let's have some fun and look at some of the differences. Please note that I will not be looking at every difference, as doing so would be lengthy enough to make 3 separate videos, which I don't currently plan on doing. We'll mostly just be looking at the more notable changes that people point to when discussing the two translations. The first, and one of the bigger changes, is the Balrog catchphrase. Balrog's huzzah is iconic, and the phrase is still viewed as his canonical English catchphrase by many gamers today. Huzzah has really echoed through people's hearts, and it has stuck ever since the early 2000s, but as we know now, Nicalis has changed it for the sake of accuracy. When questioned about the change, the founder of Nicalis defended the change, explaining that, oh yeah, isn't the translation verbatim, but it is as close as we can get to an English translation. From the context of the two battle cries, my assumption is that the original cry is intended to be some sort of prideful shout. But I also don't understand Japanese, so please take my word with a grain of salt. Plus, this correction also comes from the people behind the official translation with Daisuke Amaya's help, so they probably have a much better form of truth. Huzzah does definitely have way more charm though. Another fairly major change is that the official translation changes which character killed Arthur. According to the Aeon Genesis translation, either Balrog or Misery killed Arthur. The Nicalis translation, on the other hand, states that the Doctor himself killed Arthur. This is genuinely a much bigger difference for those who dig themselves into Cave Story lore, much like myself. And the final one I'll cover will be something that I personally feel really describes the translation differences best. In the Aeon Genesis translation, the names of every crown wearer is Halda, Anakapone, Miyakid, and Fuyuhiko Date. In the official translation, the crown wearers are officially changed to Halder, Anatupone, Miyakido, and Date Fuyuhiko. For those who didn't catch the pattern, it seems that every name was fixed of their Japanese accent, except for, strangely, Miyakid. Now, again, I don't speak Japanese, but often when the sound for the letter D finishes a word, the O sound is said after as a part of the Japanese accent. The funny thing is that the Aeon Genesis translation got rid of the accent. With every other name, it has the Japanese accent, such as Halda, Anakapone, and Fuyuhiko Date. But Miyakid is Miyakid, and with the official English translation, they decided to keep the name with its accent being Miyakido. Again, while what I listed isn't exactly gripes against the two translation differences, it is the kind of stuff you'll find when digging between the text of the two versions. And that brings us to now. What version do I think you should play? Well, honestly, I'm the worst person to ask. I love and actively play both versions of the games, and both versions have their upsides. In fact, I personally don't believe the divide in fans is as massive as it used to be, and many fans will tell you to this day that both serve as a quality way to play Cave Story in some way, shape, or form. I would personally tell you to try out both versions and keep playing the one you think you like the best. I hate for that to sound like some form of cop-out answer, but this is really the kind of answer that many will tell you. Either way, that's all for today's video. I hope you guys all enjoyed it, and I hope you all look forward to the next one. Until then, Nerdieo is out.